Okay, hello everyone. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. Today we're doing a Mu Shu Pork recipe that comes from my mom's cookbook that I grew up eating a lot, probably a couple times a month, because it's a really good recipe to feed to a bunch of very hungry teenagers. So I grew up when I was a kid eating this stuff a lot. So if you're not familiar with what a standard traditional Mu Shu pork looks like, it's a pretty common dish in America, at least, like the kind of dish that you find that comes up in Chinese American food quite a bit. You can definitely find it at like P.F. Chang's, stuff like that. Generally, you find it will be served in a bowl, and it sort of looks like a big veggie stir fry, and then you serve it in a bunch of wraps. So you wrap it up in what is essentially a raw egg roll wrapper, and then you serve it as, I guess, like a Chinese burrito or like kind of that sort of thing. So it's served as a wrap, I guess. When I was a kid, though, I never ate it like that. It never looked like that to me when I was a kid. The way that my mom always used to make it would be served in a big old platter, kind of like a big giant ciabatta platter. Egg pancakes served on top. So it was only until pretty recently when I started to work out the workshopping the recipe for this particular Mu Shu pork that I did realize that that's not actually what Mu Shu pork is at all. And the thing that we were eating is actually called Hecai Daimao, which is essentially mixed veggies with egg hat on top. So egg hat being the egg pancake that we throw on top at the very, very end. The main difference being, in addition to that egg hat, is the use of vermicelli rice noodles, which is not traditionally found in a Mu Shu pork, at least not the kind that you find in like Chinese American cuisine, like not the kind of stuff that you would find at P.F. Chang's, that sort of stuff. So when I was a kid, actually to this day, I have never seen a Hecai Daimao come up in literally any other cuisine other than at my parents' house. So for a very, very long time, I just thought that my parents were just doing it that way because that was how they wanted to get us to eat vegetables. So if you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the comments. I don't know everything about Mu Shu pork, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative, or at the very least fun to watch. As with pretty much everything that I cook on stream, this dish has a recipe video that goes along with it. All of those recipe videos, those live over on my YouTube channel. So if you're watching on Reddit, that would be the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on Reddit, or if you're watching on YouTube, it's the channel you're already on, so you already made it over there. So that's cool. This particular recipe is a recipe that we released on the YouTube channel a couple of days ago. I think that came out on Friday last week. And it was a couple of different, I did a Mu Shu pork in a couple of different ways. The first version that I did was in an effort to reproduce the original Mu Shu pork that comes from P.F. Chang's, and that's what, in my opinion, looks like a very traditional, what Mu Shu pork looks like in a really, really traditional Chinese American sense. So when you get Mu Shu pork and you order it at a restaurant, here, at least here in America, that's the kind of Mu Shu pork that you will find comes up in restaurants a lot. And the second version that I did is my mom's recipe, which is actually called Hecai Daimao, and it's not actually Mu Shu pork. But when I was a kid, that's what I always assumed was Mu Shu pork. So if you're interested in stuff like that, I recommend hopping over to the YouTube channel and checking that stuff out. In those recipe videos, not only do they move a little bit slower, so if you're trying to recreate what I'm cooking, that's a good place to be. But in addition to that, it also kind of dives into a little bit more about like the decision making that goes behind some of the recipes that I write, why I do some of the things that I do in recipes, why I leave certain things out, stuff like that. That all comes up in the recipe videos. So if you're interested in content like that, I recommend hopping over to YouTube, checking some of that out. Lots of fun stuff coming up over there. What am I cooking? Yeah, totally. Big brown bear. Thanks for tuning in. We're doing a Mu Shu pork today. So if you're not familiar, I feel like Mu Shu pork, at least like the American style Mu Shu pork, is a pretty popular thing here in America. It's what like lots of folks would refer to as like Chinese tacos or Chinese burritos or Chinese tacos, I guess. I've seen that used a lot. And it's essentially a Chinese wrap So it's a bunch of veggies that you stir fry together in a wok, and then you wrap it up together in a mu shu skin. Or today, actually, we're going to be using flour tortillas. So the version that we're doing today is based off of my mom's recipe, which as I researched the particular recipe and recreated it for myself, I discovered that what we were eating when we were kids was not actually mu shu pork. It's actually called a dish called Hecai Daimao, and you can find that stuff. I believe you can find it in mainland China quite a bit, but so far, at least growing up here in California, I have never seen it come up in any Chinese restaurant, at least not here in California. So, but I know that it does exist because my mom says so. Alright, so as with many dishes that I cook, I'm starting off with some crushed and minced garlic, followed by some finely minced ginger. Those tend to be almost always, or probably if you've watched these streams before, you'll know that those are almost always the first two things that I cut up. And that's because they go in pretty much all stir fries. They tend to be like the big base element of umami. So it's the first thing that we do anytime that we're trying to build out layers of umami is garlic and ginger. That's probably the first two things that we're going to throw into the wok. So I pretty much put it in almost every savory stir fry that I write. So. You want to know Wu's cooking? Yeah, I guess. Wu's cooking, I guess that would be my cooking? Yes? I don't know. Grammar is confusing. Alright, so next we're doing is we're going to chop up some carrots. If you're really committed, you could probably do a Julian cut. Am I going to do a Julian cut? Yeah, let's do a Julian cut. Do I want to do a Julian cut? Yeah, I guess so. If you don't feel like doing a Julian cut, you can also just chop this stuff into planks. I might actually do that if I lose effort. Yeah, I'm feeling kind of lazy. I'm probably not going to do a Julian cut. I'm just going to do planks. The difference between a Julian cut and a plank is that Julian cuts are a lot more labor intensive, whereas planks can be done pretty carefully or pretty quickly, like so. When we do our Julian cut, we do two things. First, we chop the carrot in half, and then we go for planks. So this would be our plank here, where we're going for slices down the center. And then what we do for our Julian cut is we stack it on top of each other, and then go downward for our Julian cut. Like so. So lots of times, if you're feeling super lazy, I definitely have skipped the Julian cut quite a bit because I'm lazy, especially if my knife is sharpening. Julian cuts are really difficult to do if you have a dull knife. So my knife is pretty sharp. I actually just sharpened these knives. So my knife is actually pretty sharp, which is making these Julian cuts a lot easier. But if you don't have a sharp knife, this cut can be kind of difficult to do. And also, always have a sharp knife. You should just generally have a sharp knife. Dull knives are really, really dangerous, so be very, very careful. If your knife is dull, you probably shouldn't be using it. Yay, yay, yo, yeah. Yeah, that's a great username. Also, hello. Information on this knife. Yeah, totally. So lots of people ask about this knife. The knife that I use, I got at an estate sale, which probably means that you're not going to be able to find the same knife, at least not this exact same knife. It's a French chef's knife. It's called Père Noir Nogent. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. It's a vintage knife because I got it at an estate sale, so I believe it's from the 70s. And it's no longer in production, so this particular brand of knife is no longer in production. But it is a copy of a more famous French chef's knife that is still readily available and still in production, called a sabatier. So if you're looking for a knife of this same shape and profile, you can definitely find sabatiers. I believe you can buy that stuff at like Macy's and stuff. That stuff is super readily available. So this particular knife you're going to have some trouble finding because it's a vintage knife and it's not in production anymore. But sabatier definitely still in production, although I don't know that they make it with carbon steel. So this particular knife is a carbon steel knife. That's why it patina's the way that it does. And that's also particularly why I love vintage knives, is because they're generally made of materials that so that you generally won't find like stainless steel stuff. So I love this knife mainly, particularly because it's a that's not a good cut. Particularly because it's made of carbon steel and it kind of like ages really well. So. It's so hard to do the claw grip with fingers when, yeah, totally. So the claw grip is super important, especially if you're like just new to chopping. Make sure that you're using a claw grip because you will chop your fingers off otherwise. All right, so that's our carrots. What am I drinking tonight? Yeah, today I'm drinking a Lafroig, which is a Islay Scotch. Very peaty. Lafroig is probably one of the more peaty scotches, at least from Islay. All the scotches from Islay are peaty, but it's also my favorite scotch, so I love this. I love Islay. Okay, let's see. Before we do that, let's rehydrate some stuff. Well, let's chop these in first. Alright, so next up, I'm going to do this is some Napa cabbage. I actually prefer doing this particular Mu Shu pork with Taiwanese cabbage because it's a little bit sweeter. But Napa cabbage will work just fine, and it's also what I have in the refrigerator, so. Oh, good reason, actually a good thing that I just took this out. So, if you are knife hunting, this particular knife, so you could even tell they look very similar. This one is a Sabatier, this one is a Père Noir Nugan. They're both vintage, so both of them are made of carbon steel. You'll notice that's why both of them have quite a bit of like patina going on. It looks like rust, but it's not rust. So that's the reason why it's not shiny, is because they're made of carbon steel. But the knife profile is identical, almost identical. The main difference is this bevel right here. This one is a little bit more angled. This one's a little bit more worn. So, but otherwise, they're pretty much the same knife. So if you're looking for a similar French chef's knife, I would go Sabatier because you can readily find that stuff. Sabatier is absolutely still in production. So, all right. So I'm chopping up my cabbage next. So actually, someone was just asking about the claw grip. So the claw grip super important whenever you're, I guess, like fine chopping stuff, especially if you're fine chopping stuff. We want to turn all of our knuckles inward, or all of our fingertips inward, and then let the knife rest up against our knuckles. So as it rests up against the knuckles, we have a constant understanding of where the knife is because it's up against my knuckles, which means that I don't even necessarily need to look at the knife because I know where the knife is based on where my knuckles are. So I can look at you and then I can chop. Super important. You can practice it. You can do it really slowly and it will work just fine too. I would, if you're getting very new to cooking, practice doing that claw grip, but very slowly, and that will work too. There is absolutely no reason why you need to chop really fast, unless you're like in a professional chef cooking or like kitchen. So practice it really and then build speed. But definitely, if you're new to cooking, start off with the right technique. Otherwise, you're going to injure yourself. Really dangerous. So definitely don't do any chopping like this because that's how you cut your fingers off. Super important. All right. Hello to everyone just joining. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. Today we're cooking up a Mu Shu pork recipe that I wrote, but is loosely based off of my mom's recipe for Mu Shu pork, which, as I recently discovered, as I asked her more about it while I was researching this recipe, it turns out what we were eating when we were kids is not actually Mu Shu pork at all, but another dish called Hecai Daimao. So if you're from, I believe you can find this stuff in mainland China, but if you're not from mainland China, I don't think I've actually ever seen that stuff come up anywhere else other than my parents' kitchen. So this is a particular recipe that's been super fun for me to recreate because I don't even know where else to find it. So if you're interested in what I'm cooking today, I recommend hopping over to my YouTube channel, where, as with pretty much everything that I cook on stream, the recipe video lives for this particular dish. So I did a recipe video for this version of Mu Shu pork last Friday, so last week on Friday that came out. and we did it in 2 different ways. So it was a part of our Chinese American foods series, where I recreated the Mu Shu Pork from P.F. Chang's, and that's been a whole series that we've been doing, recreating Chinese foods, Chinese American foods from restaurants like P.F. Chang's and like Panda Express, stuff like that. And kind of taking a look at like what Chinese American food is and like what makes it so American. So we did a version from P.F. Chang's, which in my opinion is like the iconic Chinese American version of Mu Shu Pork. We did that version, and then I recreated a second version that comes from my mom's cookbook, which is called Hecai Daimao. Looks very similar, except that it's served with an egg hat on top instead of tossed in all together. And then I think the main difference is that it's served with vermicelli rice noodles as opposed to as a veggie stir fry. So very, very interesting recreating this one. So if you're interested in stuff like that, I recommend hopping over to the YouTube channel and checking out some of that content. Lots of fun stuff popping up over there. We have a couple of series going on right now. There's the Chinese American series that I just mentioned. There's also a whole nother series based off of recreating foods from restaurants in the San Francisco Bay Area. So we've been doing a whole bunch of food from local Bay Area restaurants. There's one for a pad see ew from a restaurant here in Oakland called Nicha Thai. Another one from a restaurant in San Francisco called Dragon House. It's been super fun recreating a lot of that stuff because a lot of those are restaurants that I've been eating for like half of my life. So very interesting. So if you're interested in stuff, I'm checking some of that stuff out. If you're watching on Reddit, that would be the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on YouTube, it's the channel that you're already on. You already made it. Well done. We're working our way to 1,500 subscribers by the end of the month, by the way. So if you want to help us hit that subscriber goal, definitely hit the subscribe button. Only if you're interested, though. All right, so this is our vermicelli rice noodle. These particular vermicelli rice noodles are a lot thicker than what I'm used to, so I'm actually going to blanch them a little bit harder and more aggressively than I would normally. When you're working with your standard vermicelli rice noodles, I would recommend don't use hot water. I would say you could even just throw that stuff right into the pot and it would work just fine. In this particular case, these vermicelli rice noodles happen to be really, really thick, so I'm being a little bit more aggressive with it, and I am using boiling water, but I don't know that it's going to work, so we'll find out. Otherwise though, vermicelli rice noodles are really, really delicate, so you can definitely, so I was experimenting with this quite a bit when I was writing the recipe for pancit, the Filipino, which is essentially like the Filipino version of Hecai Daimao. And what I discovered is that vermicelli is really, really delicate, and you can actually rehydrate that stuff in cold water. So you can just dump it into a pot of cold water, and it will rehydrate on its own. This particular case, though, our vermicelli is really, really thick. As you can see, it's not even breaking down. So I am using boiled water here, and then we're going to let it rehydrate on its own here. Definitely an experiment, though. I don't know actually what's going to happen. We'll find out. I've never used rice noodles like this, so. I'm gonna let those sit and soak for another, say 5 minutes. We'll see what happens. But we're also going to keep our eye on it. We definitely want to make sure that that stuff doesn't overcook, for sure. All right, moving on, I'm going to start slicing up the rest of our veggies. So as you'll probably notice if you've ever eaten a Mu Shu pork before, Mu Shu pork is basically just a whole bunch of veggies stir-fried with pork. So that means that the majority of what we're doing today when we're cooking Mu Shu pork is just chopping a whole bunch of veggies. So next up, I'm chopping up some cucumber. And we're going to go for pretty similar sizes and shapes as our carrot. Because those are going to be pretty similar in texture. So I'm going to go for planks first, and then I'm going to go for a Julian cut. One more time. Alright, so that's our plank. When we flip it over, stack it on top of itself, and then cut downward, and that would be our Julian cut. One more time. So probably not the best Julian cut that I've ever done, but good enough. All right, so I'm gonna set this aside, and then we're moving on to, what is our next veggie? Ah, yeah. So next up, in my opinion, probably, in my opinion at least, the most important part of a Mu Shu pork is actually bamboo tips. So if you can't find bamboo tips, you can absolutely leave this stuff out and it would be just fine. Honestly, I hope that the general takeaway of this is that a Mu Shu pork is just a big veggie stir fry. And you can put whatever you want into it and it will be just fine. If you have bell peppers, you could throw some bell peppers in there. If you have zucchini, that would taste really great too. Really, whatever kind of veggies you have, you should use it. But for me, when I do Mu Shu pork, in my opinion, this is probably the most important part, is the bamboo shoots. So if you don't have it though, you can also substitute it for watercress, which has been, in my experience, probably the best substitute. But really though, use what you have. And bamboo shoots are pretty tender, so we're going to cut it in the same way that we cut our carrots and cucumbers. We're going for planks first, and then I'm gonna go. Don't really need a super fine Julian cut here. Same thing, we're stacking it on top of itself, then we're cutting downward. One more time. That is our bamboo shoot. If you live near an Asian grocery store, these are definitely a little bit tricky to find if you don't happen to live near an Asian grocery store, because I think they pretty much only come up in Chinese food. But if you happen to live near an Asian grocery store, especially a Chinese grocery store, these are hard to drill in, you can definitely find these fresh. So usually you'll find them, if they're fresh, you'll find them in the back, probably in the produce section. Generally they'll be soaking in a tub of water. If you can't find them fresh, in my experience, they taste almost identical when it's canned. I think maybe the fresh one is a little bit more tender, but ultimately though, especially if you're stir frying it, it's going to end up tasting the same anyway. So today I actually did not have a chance to go pick up any fresh bamboo shoots, so today we're using canned bamboo shoot, but it's still going to be very good. Alright, and that is our bamboo shoot. Alright, well that's going. Let's check on our noodles. Yeah, that's looking good. These are definitely very thick, so thicker than your average rice noodle, or definitely thicker than your average vermicelli rice noodle. So I am going to let it soak for a lot longer than I normally would, but if I was using regular old rice or vermicelli rice noodle, I would definitely just blanch that in cold water for about 10 minutes, and that's pretty much all that you need to do. While that's going, let's take a look at our wood ear mushrooms. Actually, these aren't wood ear mushrooms, these are black fungus. But definitely more traditionally what you would find in a Mu Shu pork is the use of wood ear mushrooms, which looks very similar. So if you were paying attention when I first added these to hot water, they were very small. They look like this. And when you add water to them and rehydrate it for about 10 minutes, they expand extremely well, which I love using this particular version of mushroom, because they have a very nice texture that kind of sits really well in a stir fry. So I love chopping them a little bit larger than you normally would with a shiitake mushroom, for example, and then tossing it in at the very end. It's going to be super tasty. All right. Last up is going to be our. Actually, let's do our eggs first. Yeah, sure. Second to last is our eggs. So we're going to do 2 eggs here. We're going for 2 eggs, not 3. Very, very important. We need quite a bit of egg for a Hecai Daimao. Definitely more egg than you would need for a standard Mu Shu pork. And that's because we have to make a big old egg pancake, and the egg has to cover our entire stir fry. So we're going to add this at the very, very end to our wok and finish the stir fry with a nice egg pancake on top. All right. Now, last up, let's do our pork. Actually, we probably should have done this first. All right, so for our pork today, I'm using some boneless pork chops. Normally, when I do pork chops, I would recommend using bone-in pork chops, pretty much any chance that you can get. And that's because when you leave the bone in on a pork chop, this is true for steaks too, or really any kind of meat, it gives a much more flavorful and juicier cut of meat. So when you do your steak, or like cast iron seared pan-fried pork chops and stuff like that, you want to be using a bone-in pork chop, because that bone, when you leave it into the pork chop, helps the pork chop retain a lot of its juices. In this particular case though, because we're just chopping this stuff up, I don't really see the point of using a bone-in pork chop, because you're just chopping it up anyway. So I like to just use boneless pork chops, just because it makes chopping it up a little bit easier. So I do have some bone-in pork chops, but I'm saving it for maybe the next time I do a pork chop, or like a pan-seared pork chop. But otherwise though, I'm slicing this into pretty thin slices, and then we're going to do a pretty quick marinade on our pork. Hello to everyone just joining. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're streaming every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 p.m. PST and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST. Today we're doing a Mu Shu pork recipe that comes from my mom's cookbook. That's called Hecai Daimao, which is actually not Mu Shu pork. Mainly the big differences between Hecai Daimao and a Mu Shu pork is that Hecai Daimao is served with a big old egg pancake on top, whereas in a Mu Shu pork you would normally see that egg pancake chopped up and then tossed into the stir fry, and then you have these like nice thin strips of egg dispersed throughout the stir fry. In today's version though, we're actually doing another dish called Hecai Daimao, which is very, very similar otherwise, but the main difference, at least in my experience, the main difference is that we're using vermicelli rice noodle at the very, very end. It's going to have a nice added rice noodle at the very end. If you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the comments. I don't know everything about Mu Shu pork, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative, or at the very least entertaining to watch. If you're interested in recreating what I'm cooking, I recommend hopping over to my YouTube channel, which is where all of the recipe videos live for everything that I cook on stream. Every Friday there's a new recipe that pops up over on YouTube. So this is the recipe that came out last Friday, so a couple of days ago, and lives over on the YouTube channel. This particular version, or this particular dish, is part of a series that we've been doing, recreating Chinese American foods from like those like really quintessential Chinese American restaurants, at least that you find in like America. So this version, the version that we did on the YouTube video, was recreating the Mu Shu pork from P.F. Chang's, which I thought was really, really interesting because it's like the quintessential version of Mu Shu pork that you'll find, at least here in America, like Americanized Mu Shu pork. And then the second version that we did is generally in that series, I'll do 2 different versions, and the second version is usually a more authentic approach to whatever it is that we're cooking. So when we did honey sesame chicken, for example, usually what I do when I recreate more authentic versions of Chinese American foods is I'll end up taking out a lot of sugar and a lot of sauce. So a lot of that like really, really like aggressive flavor, I end up taking a lot of that stuff out and then substituting it with something that's like a little bit more traditional, but also still in the same flavor palette. So lots of times when I remove sugar, I end up replacing it with like sweet elements, so things like black vinegar or fish sauce, stuff like that. So that's a fun series to check out if you haven't already. That all lives over on the YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/woocancook. In addition to the recipe videos, that's also where I concurrently live stream, and that would be the computer behind me. That's where the second stream also lives, so you can check that out. The live stream over on YouTube has a fun schedule of everything that I'm going to be cooking over the next couple of weeks. So if you were following the streams over on YouTube, you would have known that I would be cooking this a couple weeks ago. So, all right. So if you're interested in stuff like that, I recommend hopping over to YouTube, checking some of that stuff out, especially if you're already following over on Reddit, because lots of fun stuff popping up over on YouTube. All right, so that is my marinade for this pork. I'm sorry, I just talked through the entire marinade. But that was 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, 2 tablespoons of Shaoxing wine, 2 tablespoons of sesame oil, 2 tablespoons of hoisin sauce, and then a pinch of white pepper. I love using white pepper in meat marinades because it like permeates throughout the meat really, really well. So, and it's also like really, really thin and not quite as like present as black pepper. So it like works really well in marinades, a little bit better than black pepper in my experience. Alright, so I'm just doing a quick check on my noodles here. I think they needed a little bit more water. So here's our rice noodles. These are coming along nicely. This is the first time that I've used vermicelli this thick before, so this is very interesting. It actually doesn't look like vermicelli to me at all. It looks like just plain old rice noodles, so this is kind of interesting. But it is definitely starting to break down, which is relieving to me because I was getting concerned because it wasn't breaking down. Alright, so, oh yeah. Now, the very last thing that we're going to do is assemble our sauce. So if you've watched people assemble Mu Shu porks in restaurants, you'll know that lots of times they'll do the sauces straight into the wok. And the reason that we're not doing that today is because, or the reason that they can do that in Chinese restaurants is because they make the same dish over and over and over. They probably make it 100 times a day, which means that they don't really, or probably not even cooking to taste anymore. They're probably not even tasting what they're cooking anymore. And that's because they make it so often that they know exactly what needs to go in it. Today, I have not made Mu Shu pork that often, so I do like to be able to stop and taste the things that I'm cooking as much as I can, which means that I like to make these sauces that I add to my stir fries off heat, and that way I can taste the sauce beforehand and make adjustments as I need to. Oh yeah, how do I, yeah. Hello, Jeffrey, thank you for just getting here. How do I choose a good cut of pork? Pork is a really cheap cut, so in general, you can just look for the most tender version. The main thing that differentiates it for me is whether or not the bone is in or not. When you're looking at a pork chop, depending on what you're going to use it for, you may or may not want that bone in it. Today we're using boneless pork chop, and that's because I don't think that we actually will benefit very much from having that bone in. So I do have some bone-in pork chops, but I'm going to save it for the next time that I do a skillet pork chop. And the reason that it's really great to have that bone in your pork chop is because the bone will help the pork chop retain a lot of moisture. So when you pan sear it, it will keep the pork chop nice and moist. In today's Mu Shu pork, though, we just sliced it up into strips anyway, so I don't really think that you would benefit a whole lot from whether or not it was boneless. You used gochujang for the first time. Yeah. Your mother didn't teach you any recipes. That's funny. My mom definitely, both of my parents cooked, and they definitely did not teach me any recipes either. I actually had to pry it out of them. I probably would have gone to their grave if I didn't ask them about it. So, but this recipe though, it definitely comes from my mom's cookbook. and the way that she always, so I like, this is like one of those things that you discover start investigating things from your childhood. But when I grew up eating this stuff, I always understood this dish to be Mu Shu pork, because that's what my parents always told me it was. But as I grew, when I was researching this recipe, I discovered from my mom that this is not Mu Shu pork at all. It's another dish entirely. So very interesting though. I'm glad that you discovered gochujang though. That's really great. Gochujang, one of my favorite ingredients. And we actually just used, so that was the spicy element that goes into my sauce today is actually doubanjiang, which is the Chinese version of gochujang, which is almost the exact same thing, except it's probably not quite as sweet, and it's a little bit looser than gochujang is. But very similar flavor palettes, very, very spicy, very umami forward. Really nice thing to add in small quantities in order to bring out like a little bit of life to your sauce bases. Do I cut it up before I put it into the pan? I'm not sure if you're talking about what we're doing today or in pan sears. Definitely in pork chops with pan sears, what they always tell you, or at least what I do, is cut it out the fat cap, and that will keep it from curling. So if you've ever experienced, lots of people probably experience this, if you ever pan seared a pork chop, and then after it like starts searing on the first side, the pork chop will seize, and then it will start like kind of curling inward. And that's because the fat is starting to render, and then once the fat starts to render, it causes the whole pork chop to curl inward. And then you don't get a good sear on the part that has curled inward because it's puffed up. So what you want to do when you do a pan-seared pork chop is slice it at that fat cap, and that way when it does start seizing, it won't curl inward, and then you will still have a nice flat pork chop. For today though, we just chopped it up into really thin strips because we're just doing Mu Shu pork, which is actually why I mentioned it earlier too, is why I don't think you need to use a bone-in pork chop. I think it's a waste of a bone-in pork chop because we're just chopping it into strips anyway, so what would be the point of saving that bone? All right, so I think we're ready to head over to the stove. Hello to everyone just joining. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning into this stream, we're streaming here every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 p.m. PST and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST with new recipes that come out every Friday, usually in the morning sometime. So if this is your first time tuning in, definitely stick around and check out some of that content. In addition to live streaming here on Reddit, we also concurrently live stream over on YouTube, which is the laptop behind me. That live stream over on YouTube has a whole schedule of everything that I'm going to be cooking for probably the next 2.5 weeks or so. So if you're interested in checking out what I'm going to be cooking over the next couple of weeks, definitely hop over to YouTube and you can find out what I'll be cooking next. So if you were watching on YouTube, you would have known a couple weeks ago that I would be cooking this dish. This particular dish, which is called Hecai Daimao, is a recipe that comes from my mom's cookbook, which I recreated and as a recipe video that came out last Friday. So if you're interested in checking that out, definitely hop over to YouTube and check out some of that stuff. In that recipe video, in addition to pretty much all of the recipe videos, those recipes tend to move a little bit slower and kind of talk my way through some of the decision making that goes behind things that I do in a recipe, why I add certain things, why I leave some stuff out, stuff like that. That all happens and comes together in the YouTube videos. So the version for this Mu Shu pork is a part of a series that we've been doing on Chinese American foods. So that's a whole series that I've dedicated to doing like recreating dishes from places like P.F. Chang's and Panda Express, stuff like that, and kind of taking a look at what Chinese American food is and like what makes it so American and like what happened to Chinese food when it came to America. And what it would look like if you were to take a really traditional or like a really Americanized dish like Mu Shu pork, for example, and remove all of those American elements. So usually in those videos, there's two different recipes. The first recipe is recreating like a really like traditional Chinese American version. So this version is actually the American version for this dish is a recipe for a P.F. Chang's Mu Shu pork. And usually in those videos, I'll do a second version, which in this case is the version that my mom always made, which is called Hecai Daimao. And in those versions, what I'll do is I'll remove some of those American qualities and replace it with like a more traditional like Chinese approach to doing a dish like this. So very frequently it's super interesting because I'll do a dish that's like honey sesame chicken or General Tso's chicken. We did both of those from Panda Express. And what happens is we pull out all of those American qualities, and what you're left with is like not really any Chinese food at all, because those dishes are really just American food. So, Sand Crab, yeah, thanks for tuning in. All right, so if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely hop over to YouTube, check that stuff out. All right, so over on my wok, I have it ripping hot. This has been heating up pretty quick for a while now. You'll notice, if you've ever tuned into these streams, you probably already know this too, but you'll notice that as soon as we start putting stuff into the wok, the rest of this stream is going to come together very, very quickly. Probably the rest of what we cook will happen within the next 5 minutes. So, and that's because wok cooking is really, really fast. There's so much heat in the wok that as soon as something's in the wok, it starts cooking really, really fast, which makes it really important when you wok stir fry. To have everything ready to go before you start stir frying, because you don't want to still be chopping stuff and like cutting stuff, stirring stuff up, things like that. You don't want to be doing that once something's in the wok, because once something is in the wok, you're on a timer and stuff is probably going to start burning. So. All right, so I'm starting with my pork, going in first. I'm being very careful not to add the liquid of my marinade here. So I'm holding back as much of that liquid as possible. This is about as much liquid as I managed to hold back. And that's because we're trying to reduce the moisture in our wok here. Alright, so we're going to flash cook this for maybe a minute or two. We don't need it to be fully cooked because it is going to go back into the wok. But we are going to exercise a process in wok cooking that comes up a lot in home wok cooking, which is called batch cooking. In batch cooking, what we're doing is essentially cooking certain elements and then removing it from the wok and then cooking our next element. This is particularly important in home cooking. Whoops. Because on a home range, you don't have the same heat potential that a commercial kitchen would have. So since you don't have the same heat, your wok won't be able to retain as much heat. And without that huge amount of heat, what will eventually happen is the wok will start cooling down. So in order to combat the fact that we don't have a really, really hot burner underneath our wok, we're going to use batch cooking. So what's essentially happening is as we remove stuff from the wok, it prevents too many things from ending up in the wok. So if there's too many things that end up in the wok, what will happen is the overall temperature of that wok is going to start dropping very, very quickly. So in order to prevent that from happening, we're going to cook our pork, and then we're going to remove it, and then we're going to cook our next element. So and so on until we finish. And then at the very, very end, we combine everything into the wok, and then just toss to combine. Which means that for each element has a nice amount of time with a huge amount of heat in the wok while it's still very, very hot. So the technique of batch cooking, that's probably something that you'll see come up quite a bit in home wok cooking, because it is how we prevent the wok from cooling down too much. So I'm going to pull this out. And then I'm going to rinse my wok down. And then we're going to reheat and repeat. Super important to make sure that you do rinse the wok out. I know that it's kind of a bummer because essentially what's happening when you rinse your wok out is you're rinsing out a whole bunch of flavor. But it is really important to rinse it out though, because if you don't remember to rinse the wok out before you add your next ingredient, everything that remains is going to continue to cook, which means it's probably going to start burning at some point. So we don't want that to happen, so in order to make sure that it doesn't start burning, we need to remove it from the wok first. And then I'm going to let it reheat, so I'm going to let that wok sit for a minute, and we're going to... All right. So next up, we're adding another couple of tablespoons of vegetable oil to our wok. In Chinese cooking, this is what we call a long yao, which is essentially adding cold oil to a very hot wok and giving it a swirl, and that will create our nice non-stick surface. Oops, that's too much oil. We definitely want to make sure that we don't add hot oil. We don't want to add that oil to a cold wok and then let the oil come up to temperature with the wok in it, or with the oil in the wok, because what will happen is you will develop a very sticky surface. So we don't want that to happen. We want the wok to be hot before we add that oil in. Very important. Can you cook with a wok on an electric range? Yeah, you definitely can. Lots of folks ask that. So I'm using a gas range right now, but I have definitely wok cooked on an electric range, and it will work just fine. I would recommend, if you are cooking with a wok on an electric range, get yourself a flat bottom wok. So today I'm using a round bottom wok, which is exactly how it sounds. It's round on the bottom, which is very useful if you have a gas range because it allows the heat to disperse a little bit better. I definitely prefer using a round bottom wok, but if I was cooking on a electric top, I would definitely get myself a flat bottom wok because the heat will disperse a little bit more evenly on that electric range. I think probably the more tricky thing to navigate is if you have an induction top, and I think maybe even some electric coil ranges, probably the newer ones, have the similar problem. Is that an induction top, at least like a glass induction top, has an auto shut off, so it will turn off eventually. So the way that those induction tops work is they'll get up really, really hot, and then they'll shut off, and then they'll turn back off until it hits a cold certain point, and then it'll turn back on again, which is, that's going to be a problem in most wok cooking because you need constant high heat in order for that wok to really stay hot all the time. So that's definitely tricky. I don't think that electric coil burners do that anymore, but I know that glass top, induction top ranges will definitely do that, so that one's tricky. I would say if you are cooking on an induction top, I think the best solution that I can think of is get yourself a cast iron wok, and those things have a huge amount of heat retention, which means that you can leave it on the wok, or since they have so much heat retention, they can get really, really hot. They'll stay really, really hot for a really long time, regardless of whether or not you have an auto shut-off on your induction top. So, for an electric coil range, I would recommend any kind of carbon steel flat bottom wok. Definitely for an induction top range, get yourself a cast iron. I think is probably the best solution. It will be very, very heavy though. Don't forget, cast iron wok is super, super heavy. 51 seconds. I think we're about to lose right now. I'll probably restart the stream because we're nowhere near done. But if I lose you and you don't tune into the reboot, thanks for tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. We're streaming every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 p.m. PST, Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST. New recipes over on YouTube every Friday. So if you haven't caught some of those recipe videos, definitely bop over to YouTube. Check that out. We're also concurrently live streaming over on YouTube too. So if you want to stick around and check out the rest of the stream, hop over to YouTube and check that out. You have the shut-off type. Yeah, that's totally. I would say get yourself a cast iron wok and it will definitely work. I used to have a cast iron wok and it worked just fine. They are really, really heavy though. I think that thing weighed like 40 pounds. So be ready to have some arm strength. All right. So I have my cabbage, mushrooms, and carrots in the wok, and I'm adding a couple tablespoons of my sauce mixture, and this is going to help us build out some nice layers of flavor here, as opposed to just dumping the whole sauce in at once, in which it will probably taste similar, but I find that introducing that sauce in certain layers helps create independent flavor with each ingredient. So I love introducing that sauce at certain intervals, because it helps build a nice depth of flavor. Are you done? Yeah, we're actually almost done. I don't need to pull this out. All right, so the last couple of things that I'm adding are my cucumbers and bamboo shoots. Neither of these need to cook very thoroughly, so I don't think, I'm not super concerned about creating some nice high heat potential in the wok at this point. I like adding those two things last because I don't think that they need very, very high heat in order to cook. Bamboo shoots, you're pretty much going to be eating that stuff raw. Same with carrots, you're probably going to just pretty much eat that stuff raw anyway. So I like adding it very, very late. Do I prefer vegetable oil over sesame? Yeah, totally. So I like using both, but for different purposes. So I cook with vegetable oil, and then I use sesame oil as a flavor. So I use sesame oil. The sesame oil came up in the marinade, and then usually I use it in the sauce, but I actually just used it in the marinade today. I don't think I've ever tried to use sesame oil as a cooking oil, mostly because sesame oil is really expensive. I think for a bottle this size, which is 16 ounces of sesame oil, this was what, $5, $6? Whereas like you can get a bottle of vegetable oil for like 48 ounces, probably for the same price. So I don't think I've ever tried to cook with sesame oil unless I was like out of oil and in a pinch. Mostly just for the plain fact that it's really, really expensive to try and cook with it. So usually what I'll do is I'll cook with vegetable oil. Today I'm cooking with grapeseed oil actually, which is very, very similar. And then I use the sesame oil as a flavor. But I think the big problem with sesame oil is that it is very, very biased. So when I use it in marinade, so when we use it in the marinade today, I think I only use maybe 1 tablespoon. And that's really all that you need. Any more than that and it's going to start overpowering the entire stir fry. So yeah, I've never tried to cook with sesame oil as a cooking oil, but I would imagine if you used it in the quantity that you would need to in order to cook with it, you would definitely overpower the dish and you would end up with a pretty soggy stir fry, or a pretty sesame heavy stir fry. Yeah, sunflower oil, very good. I love using sunflower oil. I think it's a little bit like expensive, but that will also work. Sunflower oil, canola oil, vegetable oil, grapeseed oil is what I'm using today. Peanut oil, really good. I found peanut oil is very, very biased, so I don't use it too much. But anything that's neutral will work. Neutral and high heat potential. So main thing that I recommend not using in wok cooking is olive oil, because olive oil has a very, very low smoke point, which means that it will burn in a wok, and it will also taste like olive. So I don't use olive oil unless I'm cooking Italian food, basically. Is it more common for batch type wok cooking, or do people usually get special burners for higher heat? Is it more common? I think it's a little bit of both. So definitely in restaurants, they have higher burners. So the restaurant output of a restaurant burner is extremely hot. I think those things probably go like twice as hot as your average home burner. So unless you have a commercial burner in your house, you're not going to get the same heat potential as you would on a restaurant burner. So that's what they're using, is like really, really, really high heat. You can buy yourself a restaurant, a wok burner, and I've seen them over on YouTube. I know that Kenji Lopez has been demoing a few of them lately. And basically what they are is they're like a big old burner that you set up outside because it hooks up to a propane tank, and then you can get like basically what they call it, like a jet engine burner, because it gets so hot and it looks like a jet engine. And that will get you wok level heat. But you have to cook outside though, so I've never actually tried one. But if you've ever watched like street cooking, so like Korean, Taiwanese street cooking or Korean street food, that's what they're cooking in, is those big butane burners. Because they're like the kind that you can hook up to a propane tank. All So I'm removing my veggie or my stir fry here. And then we're going to do the same thing, another batch cook. So I'm removing, and then I'm rinsing my wok down, and then we're going to cook our very last ingredient, which is our eggs. So rinsing down, putting it back on the wok, reheating, and then we're going to repeat the exact same process. So while this is reheating, so back over on the stove, I have my wok very, very high heat, so high heat, and then I'm turning the heat back on, and then I'm going to let that wok come back up to heat. A wok heats very, very quickly, so that will probably come back up to temperature within like maybe a minute, probably even less than that. Over on the cutting board though, this is our finished stir fry, so what we're going to do is scramble up and then wok fry an egg, and that egg is going to cover the stir fry like a nice hat. So that's the Daimao, I think. Yeah, Daimao of Hecai Daimao, which is the hat. So Hecai vegetable, so a mixed vegetable, Daimao hat, so egg hat. And that is the part that goes over top. And that what we're going to do is cut it up into portions and then serve it inside of a wrap. Cool. Right, so while the wok is reheating, hello to everyone just joining. I know that there are probably some folks that maybe rejoined from the last Reddit stream, and if not, hello if you're brand new. My name is Wesley, this is Wu Can Cook. Today we're doing a vegetable stir fry called Mu Shu Pork. The very specific version that I'm cooking today is called Hecai Daimao, which comes from my mom's recipe cookbook, which as it turns out is the version that I used to eat when I was a kid, but as it turns out it's not the same thing at all. It's a completely different dish, and essentially the big difference that it's served with a big old egg pancake on top, and that's what the last thing that we're going to be doing today. So if you're interested in what I'm cooking, I recommend hopping over to YouTube and checking out all of the recipe videos for everything that I cook. So everything that I live stream, it has a recipe video that goes along with it, including this particular dish. So if you haven't checked that out yet, I recommend hopping over to YouTube and checking some of that stuff out. If you're watching on Reddit, that would be the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on YouTube, it's the channel that you're already on. You already made it. Hey, Hamcharo is back. Only on one channel though. Well, if you're watching on YouTube, Hamcharo is alive again. Hamcharo is the hamster that gets to eat ramen every time that someone subscribes to YouTube. So if you haven't checked that out yet, definitely check out the YouTube channel because we're working our way to 1,500 subscribers. What happened to my subscriber bar? Streamlabs is dying. Yeah, so we're working our way to 1,500 subscribers by the end of the month. If you want to help us make it there, definitely hop over to YouTube and check some of that stuff out. All right, so back over on the stove. I have my wok is ripping hot. As you can see, it is getting very nice and smoky, which is a sign that we have lots and lots of heat potential on our wok already, and we're ready to cook. So last thing that we're going to do is cook up our wok egg. All right, so we're going to long yao one more time, which is essentially adding cold oil to a hot wok. And give it a swirl, and that creates a nice non-stick surface. Ooh, what I forgot to do. Forgot to do this before I did the eggs, but really quickly, the last thing that we're going to add to our eggs is 2 elements. So we're going to add a tiny pinch of cornstarch, maybe like a 1/4 teaspoon of cornstarch, followed by a 1 teaspoon of Shaoxing wine. So that cornstarch is going to keep our eggs from overcooking too quickly. And that's because in a wok, we have really, really aggressive heat. So the cornstarch is going to protect the eggs from becoming kind of rubbery, which is probably a quality of egg that you've ever had when it's overcooked. So if you've ever had an egg that has been on a fire too long, that's what's happening. So that cornstarch is going to prevent it from overcooking. And the Shaoxing wine is probably the quintessential flavor that you've ever tasted anytime that you've had a wok fried egg is Shaoxing wine in it. So both very, very important to a wok fried egg. And I can't believe I almost forgot it. Right, so our eggs going in. And then at this point, it's very similar to how you would do, I guess I think of it very similar to how you do an omelet, which is essentially we're going to rotate the wok just to make sure that as much of the egg makes contact with the wok as possible. And then we have a nice egg pancake. So if you ever made an omelet, it's very similar to that. So I'm going to give that maybe another 30 seconds and then we're going to flip. Cool. All right. 1, 2. No. There it is. All right, let's plate this up. So the very last thing that we want to do anytime that we cook in a wok is clean the wok before you do anything else. So that's super frustrating to do because there's finished food that you want to eat that's sitting in front of you. But it's super important to make sure that you clean the wok before you do anything else, because while the wok is still hot, you still have a very nice non-stick surface going on your wok. So once it cools down, so if you were to say, sit down and eat what we just finished cooking and then clean your wok, what would happen is that wok is going to start crusting and everything is going to start sticking to the wok, which is not good, because then we have to start doing things that we never want to be doing in a wok, which is things like scrubbing and like starting using sponges. You might have to use stainless or steel wool. All of those are things that you really don't want to have to throw down when you're cooking in a wok, because a wok, especially a carbon steel wok like the one that we're using today, has a seasoning on it. So that's what we're doing right now. And you want to avoid scrubbing that seasoning off. If you have to get the sponge out, then you're probably going to start scrubbing away some of that seasoning, which is never good. So I just rinsed it off. Everything came off right away. And then I'm coating it with a tiny bit of vegetable oil, and that's it. So, very important wok care. Make sure that you take care of your wok. Don't leave stuff sitting in it, otherwise it will definitely damage the wok. Alright, so last up, I'm going to be serving this in some plain old flour tortillas. So if you want to get really, really traditional with it, you can definitely serve it in Mu Shu Pork wrappers. So I do have some Mu Shu Pork wrappers. I personally prefer flour tortillas, if I'm being totally honest, because it's basically what I grew up eating was in flour tortillas. But if you want to stay super traditional, that's probably the most traditional solution is Mu Shu Pork wrappers. But I would definitely recommend, if you're using Mu Shu Pork wrappers, those things are super, super thin and they will definitely tear. So when I use Mu Shu Pork wrappers, I've gotten in the habit of doubling up on it and using 2 at a time because they're crazy thin. The show on the Learning Channel, yeah, that would be, I believe, Yan Can Cook. So that would be the channel, or the show that I based this channel off of, which is a Martin Yan show called Yan Can Cook. At least that was, I think it was on PBS. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Yan Can Cook was on PBS. And then I'm finishing this with some hoisin sauce. And then we're wrapping it up, and this is the reason why people call this a Chinese burrito, is because it looks very similar to a burrito. Yeah, Yan Can Cook, you found it. Nice. Yeah, Martin Yan, that was what this channel was based off of. So when I started this channel, It was in an homage to Martin Yan's show, Yan Can Cook. Yan Can Cook is back on Instagram, which I recently discovered. So he has a really great Instagram channel that's like doing a bunch of crazy stuff. I know that he has a whole line of frozen foods that just came out on Costco, so that's really interesting. So super stoked to see Yan Can Cook kicking around still. So super fun. What do I have below the egg? Yeah. So what we're making today is a dish called Hecai Daimao, which is essentially Mu Shu pork. If you've ever had Mu Shu pork before, it's really popular in like Chinese American cuisine. As like usually seen as a stir fry, so you generally see Mu Shu pork done in a big bowl, and then we'll have the egg in it, but that egg is usually cut up into strips and then served in like as a part of the stir fry, so it will be tossed together. Hecai Daimao is very similar, but the main difference being is that we use vermicelli rice noodles, which you definitely would not see in a standard Mu Shu pork, and it's finished with an egg on top. So it's vegetables, like the vegetable stir fry is underneath, and that egg sits right on top. So we have this nice egg hat. So Hecai Daimao literally translates to mixed vegetables with a hat, with an egg hat or a hat. So Hecai, mixed vegetables, Daimao hat. So this egg, it sits on top, and then we serve it kind of like an enchilada, if you would. And that's like the version of Mu Shu pork that I always grew up eating because it's the version that my mom used to make. So. The soy sauce gives it the, yeah, totally. So, yeah, just like any other Mu Shu pork, you can also, so if you've ever had Mu Shu pork in a restaurant, you can also just eat it straight up out of the bowl. You can eat it with veggies or like rice too, just like any other stir fry. The version that I always knew when I was growing up as a kid, we always ate it with flour tortillas, which is what we're doing today. If you have never tried it with flour tortillas, you might, like if you've ever had Mu Shu pork in a restaurant, it's generally served with Mu Shu wrappers, which I believe are basically raw lumpia wrappers, which is like really thin. So when I use Mu Shu wrappers, usually what I'll do is I'll double up on them because they're stupid thin. I think the first time that I did it, when I was writing this recipe, when I started using them, I must have ripped like 10 of them. What's on the plate under the tortilla? Oh, that's just the plate. So it's the plate design. Yeah, totally. So, thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. We're live streaming every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 p.m. PST and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST. We have new recipes that come out every Friday, usually Friday morning in the Pacific time zone. So if you are interested in checking out what I'm going to be cooking next, the schedule for everything that I cook, it lives over on YouTube. So if you're interested in following along and finding out what I'm going to be cooking next, that all lives over on YouTube where we concurrently live stream. So if you've been following along, there's a second computer behind me. That's the live stream for YouTube. So there's a whole bunch of people that follow over on YouTube, and if you were following on YouTube, you would have known a couple weeks ago that I would be cooking this today, because that whole schedule, it's up there longer than I can remember. So usually when I go grocery shopping, I actually have to check the YouTube channel myself to find out what I'm supposed to be cooking today. So, but generally on Tuesdays, if the recipe that I released on Friday is something that I can eat for dinner, generally Tuesday I will be cooking the thing that I released on Friday. So last Friday we released the recipe for this Mu Shu pork. In that recipe video I did, it was a part of a series that we were doing on Chinese American foods. And I did two different versions. The first version was the version from the Mu Shu pork from P.F. Chang's. And in that version, I like using the P.F. Chang's version as like a benchmark because it's like the most American version of Mu Shu pork that you can create. And in that version, it looks like pretty much any other Mu Shu pork that you've ever had. It's like a big stir fry that's kind of tossed together with the eggs included. And then we did it with Mu Shu wrappers. But generally when I do videos for that part of that series, I'll do a second version. And in that second version, I'll do something where I'll remove some of the American qualities. So in this particular case, what I did is I just recreated the version that my mom always served for us, which is called Hecai Daimao. But that tends to get really interesting if I'm doing something that's really American. So things like General Tso's chicken or honey sesame chicken. We also did kung pao chicken, things like that. A lot of those dishes, probably not kung pao chicken, but definitely General Tso's chicken and honey sesame chicken. That stuff, it doesn't have any basis in Chinese food at all. It's purely just an American dish. So it's really interesting to recreate some of those dishes without the American qualities because it's sort of like recreating American food, but as you would in a wok stir fry. So lots of times when I recreate some of those things, what I end up doing is removing a lot of sugar from it and then replacing it with a lot of the like sweet elements that you find in Chinese food. So things like black vinegar, fish sauce, Shaoxing wine, oyster sauce, hoisin sauce, all of those things. They're very, very sugar forward, but they're not necessarily just pure sugar. So a lot of times when I recreate like a traditional version of an American dish, what I'll do is I'll replace it with some of those ingredients and kind of like take a look at what Chinese American food would look like if it wasn't American, basically. So that's a fun dish to check out. Take a bite, yeah. I always forget to take a bite. Yeah. Very good. It's very like flavor forward. That sauce is really in your face. You can definitely, that doubanjiang comes out very clearly. I think for me, like a big part of Mu Shu pork is the use of just like straight hoisin sauce on top. Like when I was a kid, I used to eat hoisin sauce like it was ketchup. So like in the same way that I would eat ketchup on like scrambled or like breakfast burritos, I would use hoisin sauce on Mu Shu pork. So that for me, like a big part of Mu Shu pork is that use of just like pure hoisin sauce right on top of the dish, because you're just like, it's right there, it's like right in your face, you know, as opposed to like normally when we use hoisin sauce, it's like mixed into the marinade, and it's kind of a subtle sugary element that you get. In this particular instance, it's just right there, and you like that really does it for me. That's kind of like what ties the dish together for me. Also in the flour tortilla. Yeah, so anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, so that series, it's a whole series that we've been doing recreating Chinese American foods. That's been a super fun one to take a dive into. We have another series that's entirely dedicated to recreating food from Bay Area restaurants. So we did a pad see ew that was based off of the pad see ew from a restaurant in Oakland called Ni Cha Thai. We did a Westlake soup from a restaurant in San Francisco called Dragon House. Those recipes, they tend to be a little bit more authentic and draw very heavily from, most of the time drawing heavily from like things that I used to eat when I was a kid most of the time. So stuff like that, if you're interested, I would definitely recommend hopping over to the YouTube channel and checking some of that content out. All of the recipe videos for pretty much everything that I cook on stream, they live over on YouTube. And you can also find out what I'm going to be cooking next. So, did I use cornstarch? Do I cornstarch the soy sauce? So I did use cornstarch. Actually, I only used cornstarch in the egg. Today I didn't use cornstarch in very many things. But generally, yeah, I do use cornstarch in a lot of stuff. Cornstarch is like the secret ingredient that's in like almost every Chinese dish that you've ever had. It's probably in there. If you're eating something that's Chinese and it has a sauce base that's very thick, that's definitely got cornstarch in it. So it reminds me a lot, if you've ever cooked Italian pasta, it reminds me a lot of the way that Italian pasta uses pasta water. We'll use that pasta water because the water that you cook your pasta in, it has a bunch of starch in it. So you use that pasta water to thicken up sauces. So you use in like carbonaras and like bologneses, all of that is including pasta water because it's using the starch from the pasta to thicken up a sauce. So in Chinese food, we do a very similar thing, but instead of that pasta water, we use cornstarch. So today I actually did not use any cornstarch. It might have been the first time in a long time that I've done a stir fry that doesn't have cornstarch in it. So. Yeah, totally. You found the PF Chang's recipe. Yeah, totally. I'm pretty sure the recipe that I wrote uses cornstarch. I think it uses it in the marinade. But today, the only place that we used cornstarch today was in the egg. That's the other place that you'll find the use of cornstarch in wok cooking a lot, is in anything that has like a marinade element to it. So you'll use it in like pork marinades, beef marinades, chicken marinades a lot. Because what it does is it coats the meats and eggs we used in the egg today. It will coat the thing that you're marinating. And it will give it a nice protective layer so that when you throw it into the wok fry, because the wok fry is very, very aggressive, it will prevent it from turning really rubbery. So, and we used it in the egg very specifically so that we have a nice tender egg that's still like wok fried and it's like flash cooked on very, very high heat. Without that cornstarch, it would definitely get a rubbery egg, which is not what we're after. So that's one of the, like cornstarch, it comes up in Chinese, like wok cooking in general all the time. So. If you're eating something that has like a meat marinade involved, or if it has a sauce base in it, you're probably eating cornstarch at some point. So anyway, thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. PST. Doing, I think we're doing dan dan mian. Doing some kind of noodle, I think. I forget what I'm supposed to be cooking tomorrow. We're cooking something tomorrow, so definitely tune in tomorrow. We're back at 6 p.m. PST tomorrow, and then Thursday at 6:30 p.m. PST. And then Friday we have a new recipe for gochujang fried chicken. Yeah, I think I'm doing. Yeah, so this Friday is coming up is the Korean fried chicken from Shake Shack, which I'm super stoked for. So Shake Shack just released a sandwich, fried chicken sandwich. It's a Korean fried chicken sandwich with a gochujang glaze, and I kind of just jumped on it because lots of people have been asking me to do a Korean fried chicken. So I kind of just used it as a reason to make Korean fried chicken. So that's coming up this Friday. So definitely hop over to YouTube. I don't know if we've hit 1,500 yet, but if we haven't hit 1,500 yet, definitely help us hit that January subscriber goal. So if you're watching on YouTube, someone can let me know if we're at 1,500 yet. But if you're not subscribed yet, definitely hop over to YouTube to help us hit that goal. If you're already subscribed, thank you for tuning in on YouTube. I'll see you guys soon. I'm going to be around cleaning up, so I'm going to switch the mic off. But if you have any questions, feel free to drop your questions in the comments, and I'll be around cleaning up so you can I can respond. All right, thanks everyone. See you soon.
Sun.